Hey guys, what's going on? It's Dan, and I'm back for another set of power rankings. This time we are looking at the UDL Season 3 Arcanine Division. The Arcanine Division was an auction power ranking that is using a max format. So with that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at the methodology before we get started. Coach and playstyle are not going to be taken into consideration for these power rankings. I'm going to rank them as if 100 equally skilled players were each given a team and then asked to play every matchup against one another. And if that sort of giant round robin occurred, this is what I would expect the final standings for the teams to look like. And a higher ranking does not necessarily mean I believe that that team will be favored over a lower rated one. As in the example listed, number 2 could have a 60% favorite over number 1, but against the rest of the field, number 1 could have a 60% win rate compared to number 2's 54% win rate, and that would justify number 1's overall position because I believe it would come out first in the final standings, not necessarily in that 1v1. So let's go ahead and dive on into our number 12 team. We have the Shadow Ducks. I completely understand this team is a meme, but I have to rate it at least on the same methodology as everything else. So let's take a look at the EV theme team that also has 3 weather setters and a Meowstic, which can functionally be a 4th weather setter. Cool theme, lots of cool Pokemon, but this team doesn't really work as a cohesive unit. Tyranitar by itself without a sand abuser isn't the greatest. Sylveon is actually going to be able to put in a lot of work in this format, but Sylveon also wants some speed control, and the only speed control really is that Prankster Meowstic, which I don't think is going to be enough. Leafeon and Torkoal is going to be a main mode here, along with Glaceon and Ninetales, and those are both legitimate modes, but I think when they're main modes, that really shows why this team is going to struggle. I do think Jolteon, Vapor, I do think, a lot of the pieces here are good in a vacuum, but I just think that this team overall lacks a lot of cohesion, and I completely understand it's a meme team, so I'm not going to really dig into it that much. It will probably pick up some games, though, if you're not careful against it, because a lot of these evolutions do have quite a bit of power, and Tyranitar can't be slept on. But let's go ahead into the number 11 team. We have the Salty Suicunes up next, and here's where we're going to start talking a bit more seriously about the teams. We've got the Thunderous Eye, the Miltank, the Gourgeist, the Obstagoon, Cresselia, the Kingdra, Luxray, Pelipper, Scizor, Clefable, and Lampin. So let's talk about some of the good on this team first. You've got the obvious raid mode with Pelipper plus Kingdra. That's going to be able to put in a rather substantial amount of work. On top of that, you've got the Thunderous Eye that, as an offensive form, is going to be pretty good. But there are some things on this team that I'm questioning. For example, Cresselia is generally a Trick Room setter. I can see a few other things that it's going to have access to in this set, but it is generally a Trick Room setter, so we have to take that into consideration here. And this slowest thing on this team, I think, is base 65. Gourgeist could have a form that's below that, so maybe that's a Trick Room mode, but I don't think it's great overall. And then Clefable is probably the best redirector in the format, or at least up there with Togekiss and DDF, but you have to really consider what it's trying to do redirection for. Like, if it's for the Scizor, Heat Wave gets past it, so you're not going to be redirecting that many fire attacks. If you put it next to the Thundurus, that's fine, but Thundurus by itself isn't going to have a huge amount of offensive output, and I guess that's my main problem with this team, is that outside of that rain mode, the overall offensive output seems low. And I think with low overall offensive output, this team can really struggle to pick up some kills at different points during this game. So moving on to the next team, we've got the Boston Bisharps. So overall, this team's pretty interesting. You've got Heatran pouring on 2 Togekiss. I do want to say Heatran and Togekiss work really well together. And you've got the Blastoise, Escavalier, Sableye, Glalie, Sigilyph, Dradagon, Vileplume, and Manectric. So Heatran Togekiss is a legit core, and that's going to be pretty solid. Porygon 2 is, of course, one of the better options in terms of Trick Room Trick Room setters and attackers, and it's got some other flexibility as well. Blastoise is going to be a great intermittent piece here, but I think that's the problem on this team. It's got a lot of pieces, but not a lot of cohesion. The most obvious synergy is, of course, the Heatran Togekiss, but that is still very vulnerable to Earthquake, and there's no Rillaboom to counteract that. The Vileplume really wants to operate in the sun, and Sableye is the main sun setter, but a Vileplume Sableye lead isn't going to scare a lot of people. Glalie can function as a low tier, but it doesn't do that much. And then the Blastoise Togekiss is going to be a decent setup option as well, but this is another team where I'm worried a bit about speed control, and I'm worried about damage output. Like, there's going to be a lot of reliance on the Sigilyph for speed control, and there's going to be a lot of reliance on Heatran Blastoise for damage output, and while they're both decent at it, I don't think I like either of them as main attackers on the team, which is why I've got this team overall as number 10. Don't get me wrong, it's got a lot of really cool pieces, but the damage output does make me pretty nervous about it. So yeah, let's move on to number 9, where we've got the Rhody Rhydons. So this team's pretty interesting. We've got the Cinccino, the Raikou, Fletchinder, Magmortar, Dracozolt, Scrafty, Slowking, Glastrier, Bronzong, Mudsdale, Cradily. Let's start with the obvious. This team is a Glastrier team that has access to Bronzong, so it's going to be very, very solid in terms of Trick Room mode. Like, it's got the very obvious mode there. And then it's also got Priority Tailwind and some speed as well. And, oh, I forgot to mention, Slowking next to Glastrier are also really good. I would love a little bit of redirection on this team to help it out, but it's the fast modes on this team that seem a little sus to me, and the fact that Glastrier and Mudsdale are going to want to fill the same role, and if your Trick Room mode is going to be Bronzong, Slowking, Glastrier, and Mudsdale, that's just a lot of redundancy within that Trick Room mode. You could keep one of those setters and one of those sweepers, maybe give yourself one more support option and some redirection, and it would work a lot better. Looking at the offensive mode, like the fast mode, the Dracozolt really wants Sand to threaten sort of dual modes. Here it's going to be mostly a Hustle Max option, which is good because it's functionally the only major max option for the fast mode. And I think that's a problem with this team. Is that it doesn't have a lot of things that want to max, and even its main max target usually functions better as a non-max sort of sand mode Pokemon. So, do I think this team's going to find some creative ways to get some maxes? Yes, I do. But damage output on their non-Trick Room mode makes me nervous, and the lack of redirection makes me nervous about their consistency of getting up Trick Room. So overall, that's why I've got this team at number 9. It's going to be pretty solid, but I don't think it's going to be just overwhelming in any sort of game, despite the Glastrier. Looking at our number 8 team, we've got the Raleigh Rapidash. Okay, so again, a lot of really cool pieces on this team. I love Tornadus T in formats like this, and Whimsicott and Mienshao are both great support options. You gotta respect the mascot pick. Then you've got the Arcanine, Porygon Z, Kingler, Tapu Bulu, Sandaconda, Magneton, Gothitelle. So, off the bat, you see what this team wants to do offensively, and it's mostly focused around that Porygon Z. Other offensive options are that Tornadus, Bulu, and Arcanine. So there are a decent amount of offensive options, but overall, I think this team's support options are great. It's pretty soft to Trick Room, though. There's not really great Trick Room counters in the team. Even Magneton, which you'd think is going to be pretty slow, is faster than Magnezone, as it's actually base speed 70. Gothitelle itself can work to counter some Trick Room options, but I do think it's a little bit soft to Trick Room overall, which is one of the big detriments to this team. But on top of that, its offensive output is decent, but it's obvious that Porygon Z is going to be the primary mode most of the time. Like, that's just so much better than everything else, except for maybe Max Tornadus. Arcanine's offensive output is not quite as good as you think it's going to be at any point in time. It's more of a support, like, pivot piece, and it's very good at the support pivot piece role, but the offenses on this team make it a little sus for me, and the anti-Trick Room modes, but I do think that this is where we start looking at some really solid teams that do work well together, because obviously, like, Whimsicott, Porygon Z is going to be awesome together, and Slightly less, obviously, Mienshao or Arcanine next to Tornadus is going to be a great offensive mode as well. And then you do have some other offensive threats, like the Kingler and the Bulu, but I just think overall they're less overwhelming. And they're going to be a bit more output challenged than some of the things on the top row. So I like this team, but I don't think it's great. I think it's good. But we're going to start moving on into teams that I think are really quite good, and every team that I have between power ranking 4 and 7 could functionally be interchangeable on the ranking list. I think there's an obvious top 3, and then I think 4 through 7 are very close as well, but I settled on the Chicago Kubfus in 7. So let's start with the really good here. Latios plus Spectrier plus Corviknight, they're really good max core there that can threaten a lot of damage output. Entei is a great offensive non-max option as well. Mamoswine can function either in max or out of max, so there's a lot of offensive pressure here. And then Kang as well, to some extent, helps. Now, the Alchemy can support a lot of things here, and the Tangrowth can as well, especially with redirection. But then you start looking at the Impotent Pikachu Skuntank. Yeah, there's going to be little bits and pieces that they each can do, like obviously Pikachu's going to be there to redirect electric moves from the Corviknight and maybe trigger a weakness policy on it. Skuntank is going to be there to try to stall out some Trick Room modes, but I do think Trick Room is going to be a big weakness of this team. Everything on it is relatively fast, so I do think if Trick Room goes up, it's going to be able to do a lot of damage against this team. On top of that, although there's a lot of pretty evenly distributed damage output outside of the Spectrier, which it has a very limited move pool, there's not an overwhelming amount of one-shot potential on this team. Like, you can't just stick a Life Orb on anything and then say, okay, I can one-shot anything with this Pokemon in max. Spectrier, and maybe to some extent the Latios as well, have that potential. But this is a very bulky offensive team that just has a Spectrier stapled onto it. So I dinged it a little bit compared to the other 3 teams that are in this tier, just because I think the overall output and the softness to Trick Room is going to be slightly lower, which is why I've got this team at number 7. I think this is a great team. It looks like a team that is something that I'd consider putting together, but I don't think it's going to be quite as good as some of the other options. Up next in the 6th spot, we have the Montana Metagross. I know I've been talking a lot about output issues for a lot of the other teams. This team does not have them. Moltres is a very underrated max option. Rillaboom can output a lot of damage without putting more max pressure on the team. Metagross, if you can trigger a weakness policy on it, even without it, it's going to be doing a lot of damage. Milotic is a bit of protection for that Rillaboom from Intimidate. Kommo has a bit of output that it can do as well, not as much as some of the other things, but Galarian Darmanitan is an awesome non-max option, and if you do want to do a sneaky like max Zen mode set, it's also going to be very powerful. So this team obviously is going to be able to put out a lot of damage, and it's obviously going to have a really awesome fast mode because there's not going to be much that's going to be able to stop this Drifblim from getting up Tailwind next to the Rillaboom. So that's really good, the offensive output. And it's got one of the best support pieces in Grimmsnarl as well next to it. Oh, and I just saw the Palisand and Icelgor combo too, so it's got a lot going for it. But one thing it doesn't have going for it is its speed tiers, specifically its low-end speed tiers. Carbink itself is not just an anti-Trick Room mode because you're not going to bring it every week to prevent Trick Room, and even if you do, it's not going to be doing too much against it. So this team might have the highest damage potential in the league, but it really, really hates it if Trick Room goes up, and there's a good Trick Room attacker against it. That's basically all I can say about it. Like, obviously awesome draft, obviously very well put together. It's going to want to go fast and hit hard, and it's going to be able to do that. But it's just so soft to Trick Room that it leaves me a little worried about it, which is why I have it in the 6th slot. At number 5, we've got the Handsome Forest. Yeah, this team's a Sun team with also a Terrain mode and a very solid underrated Trick Room mode as well, and some good support options. Like, this team checks every box for what I like in a team. Obviously, you got the Venusaur Ninetales that's going to function well in Sun. You've got Blaziken, which is a great max option, even outside of Sun, but in Sun, its max Flare is going to be doing so much damage, especially if it gets set up. The Persian and the Purloin, there's a bit of redundancy there. Like, keep the Purloin, you can ditch the Persian for something else. The Frostmoth is actually going to be a solid tertiary max option a lot of the time as well, and Zapdos is also going to be a great max option. So, one thing you'll notice I'm saying is that she has 6, maybe 7 awesome max options, but I think that puts actually a bit too much max pressure on this team. Because Zapdos wants to function in max, especially if there's no rain, because Stab Hurricane isn't going to be super consistent outside of max. The Blaziken absolutely wants to function in max, like it can function outside of max, but it's going to be less efficient. The Venusaur can do Sleep Powder stuff outside of max, but if you're going to run an offensive set, you do want to be maxing it, going for some max Quakes, max Flares off of Weather Ball, that kind of thing. And Drampa is also obviously a max Pokemon. So if she can put together a weekly game plan where it's not just like a bunch of max options and then one of them gets maxed and then you hope the other ones can do their job, then I think this team's going to be very solid, because it does check a lot of boxes, but it does worry me a bit based on just how much each Pokemon on this team really wants to max and the fact that there's no redirection on this team. Like, stick a Clefable on this team and it might be the top team, but I really think that the lack of redirection and the max pressure is going to leave this team just slightly more frail than it looks like on paper. Team number 4, we've got the Seattle Super Lax. So, a lot of awesome things about this team. We've got the Koko, Tauros, Landorus, Thievul, Hitmonchan, Garbodor, Ludicolo, Politoed, Celesteela, Marowak, Reuniclus. Let's start with the obvious. Koko, Thievul, well-established, awesome draft mode. Landorus, T. It has a lot less consistent results than a lot of the other things on this team, but it is still a Landorus T. It's got that 145 attack, and if you're maxing it, max Airstream, it's going to be dealing a lot of damage. I've got some experience drafting it, and it's not drafted a lot, but it's really, really good. That quad weakness to Ice does hurt, but it is solid. And then you've got an obvious Rain mode with a Celesteela as well. Again, pretty awesome, well-established group there, and the Trick Room mode that I like with the Reuniclus and the Marowak. Again, this team really wants redirection, but not every team can have that, I understand, and it's got some obvious coaching stuff that it can do with the Hitmonchan, maybe some Scarf Bulldoze or Icy Wind stuff it can do with the Tauros. Like, it's got a lot of things going for it. It's like you can see on paper, obviously, why this team's good. But let's focus in a little bit on the potential downsides of this team, because there are some of them, and they're a bit less obvious than the good sides of this team, because obviously, like, you can see what the good stuff is. One, the max pressure on this team is absolutely insane. If you're in a fast mode, you want to max Landorus every time it comes out. But on top of that, you want to max Koko every time you lead it next to Thievul. Like, there are some support Koko sets that can go really well, but you don't want to be forced into that every time. You want to maintain that flexibility with Koko. Celesteela wants to max every time, and Ludicolo even wants to max a good majority of the time. So there's so much max pressure on this team, it's going to be kind of difficult to manage. And then there's a little bit of anti-synergy in bits and pieces. You've got Koko and the Marowak that has Lightning Rod at least once this season. It's forgivable to launch an electric attack into that Marowak because it will happen to everyone once. If it happens a second time, feel free to viciously mock this coach because you can't let it happen a second time. The electric terrain being set for rain, I've done this before. It does really boost opposing electric attacks into your rain team, and because Celesteela is also going to be going into that rain team, like, there is going to be some potential anti-synergy there if you bring Koko next to your rain core. You don't necessarily have to do that, but it is going to be a pretty common occurrence to see, like, Koko, Landorus, Thievul, Rain, Steela as a 6. So you have to be careful to play around that. And yeah, that's basically the main thing, is there's little bits and pieces of potential anti-synergy that aren't really going to be hugely impactful for this team, but are going to force a lot more careful play than some of these other teams where there's not that anti-synergy, and the max pressure is just absolutely immense on this team. Just everything wants to max for the most part. Even in the Trick Room mode, both those Pokemon enjoy being in max as well. So while I think this team is very solid, I have to put it in at number 4 due to those small downsides. Moving into the top 3, I think these teams are all exceptional. We'll start with the Snowbelle Blizzards. This looks like a team that I would draft, and it's phenomenal. You've got the Regieleki Dragapult, which is going to be doing a lot of fast stuff. This is the fastest team in the format. It doesn't need Tailwind to have a fast mode, and that's always a great place to be. You've got beat up potential into that for Virizion. You've got Xatu, which can flex Tailwind or Trick Room if you need it to, and you've got some redirection as well as output from Azumarill. You've got a potential Trick Room mode with the Gothorita, Azumarill, and Copperajah, and then Rotom Wash is a great pivoter. So why isn't this team number 1 if it's so great? Well, because the other two teams are also exceptional. Beyond that, this team does have a very strong argument for number 1. I'm just a little bit worried about the damage output of this team. Like, obviously, Regieleki is going to be high damage output, but if you look at the rest of this team, Dragapult's base 120, so that's going to be decent output when fast. Unboosted Virizion, it doesn't do that much damage. Volcarona really wants to set up at least a little bit, same with Rotom. So this team needs a turn to get going. It doesn't have that sort of, I'm going to hit the field and I'm going to threaten you with massive damage Pokemon on it. And I think that that's the potential biggest downside to this team. Otherwise, I think it's very, very solid. It's got a lot of lead options and can do a lot. But the fact that it's going to need a turn or two to get the engine going on it, I think just puts it slightly behind the other two teams. In the second spot, we've got the Great Lake Aces. Again, argument for any of these three teams to be number 1. Aces obviously have Tornadus next to Cinderace, Primarina, Regidrago, and Marowak. Marowak under Tailwind can outspeed base 130, so keep that in mind as well. It's very threatening into Tapu Koko. But looking at this team overall, like, massive damage output. You've got the Regidrago next to Tailwind. You need to have a way to deal with that. That doesn't just fold to the Primarina next to Tailwind or the Cinderace next to Tailwind. Honestly, the weak spot on this team might be the Cinderace, just based on the way that the draft is set up, because I think the Primarina and Regidrago are actually going to function much better as Tailwind sweepers than that Cinderace is. And the Persian I really like on these sort of Tornadus teams, and I do think it's going to be doing a lot to help set up the Primarina and the Regidrago. But if you have it next to the Cinderace, there's a little bit of speed issues there. You can screech and attack with it, but the overall offensive output there is going to be pretty high, but it's also going to be very susceptible to Intimidate and really good switchings. So I do think, actually, as weird as it is to say it, the Cinderace is the weak part of this team, because you see, like, the obvious Trick Room mode, you see a lot of the powerful things, and I think of the main offensive modes, I'd much rather have Torn Drago and Torn Primarina as my go-tos. Cinderace is a good secondary option, but I think that there's a tendency for over-reliance on it based on the team here, where other things might be better. The last point of criticism I have for this team is the Lucario. I've drafted Lucario before, and I like it, but it just never feels good enough to make the group of 6, especially on a team like this. So I think that's a slot that could go somewhere else, and Cinderace is the steel type on this team, not Lucario. And basically everything Lucario does, Cinderace does better. So I do think there's a bit of redundancy there. But yeah, like I said, I consider this team much more of a Tornadus, Primarina, Regidrago team, with a Cinderace as a backup if for some reason that's not going to work. So if that Cinderace was something like Metagross or another type of really bulky offensive option that really loves Tailwind, we're having an entirely different conversation here. But I think the fragility of Cinderace makes it just slightly worse than the team we've got in first place, just based on the overall composition. And that's going to be the Clinton Clefables. So let's start with this team having the best redirector in the format, at least up there with Clefable and Togekiss, and in DDF. Next to in DDF, you've got Moltres and Slurpuff. Like, that trio right there, I've drafted before, and it is absolutely phenomenal together. Because you have to be worried about Max and DD, Max Moltres, and then the Slurpuff with access to String Shot and Fake Tears just supports them so well. On top of that, you also just have a Sand mode with Excadrill Gigalith that's going to do a lot of damage. You've got Weakness Policy proc with the Frostlass. You've got Araquanid, which just is impressive every time it comes out. And you've got the Rotom Heat, which is really just a good, flexible piece on this team. It does add a little bit of a rock weakness, which is why I almost put this team below the other two that I have in this tier with it. But I think offensively, this team just threatens so much with such immediacy that it's going to be hard for a lot of the other teams to deal with. Where this team is soft is the Trick Room mode. Obviously, Audino is not the best setter, and then Lurantis, while actually really good in Trick Room, isn't going to like single-handedly stop anything else from coming, and you can't coaching it either, which is the problem. I didn't mention even coaching Railu is awesome on this team. So there's a lot of really, really solid modes here, a lot of immediate damage output, and a lot of bulk. The speed control is going to be pretty reliant on Slurpuff, which, you know, I guess there's some Icy Wind options with the Frostlass as well. Slurpuff is really good at speed control. Maybe this team would want a second option, but I'm okay with that as the main speed control option, especially since there is also just a Sand mode. And then this team is very Indeedee centric, so that's one of the main downsides, is if opponents can neutralize the Indeedee by fighting its terrain, getting it out early, this team becomes a lot weaker. So again, that's why I almost had it below the Blizzards and the Aces, but I just think overall the weaknesses on this team are slightly less pronounced than the weaknesses on the previous two teams, even if the strengths are also slightly less pronounced. But I just think the power of Indeedee Slurpuff is really going to carry this team through a lot of different options, and that's why I've got it at number 1. So overall, my rankings go Clinton Clefables, Great Lakes Aces, Snowbelle Blizzards, Seattle Super Lax, Handsome Forest, Montana Metagross, Chicago Kubfus, Raleigh Rapidash, Rhody Rhydons, Boston Bisharps, Salty Suicunes, Shadow Ducks. For me personally, teams 1 through 7 I think are all going to be really good championship contenders regardless of the coach. And then the last 5 teams, I think you're going to have the coach really show up and ball out to make them close to the same level as the other 7, but it's definitely not impossible. Every team here has some tools, and again, these rankings are not predictive. They are my opinion. They are completely done for fun and just an exercise to look at each of the teams, discuss little bits of potential points of strength and weakness. But thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you guys later. Bye.